So welcome everyone. My name is Rashida Scar. I am a librarian with Marin County Free Library. I'm based in the South Novato branch. I want to introduce who we have who will be sharing with us, speaking with us today. With Serge Marin, and Serge stands for Showing Up for Racial Justice. We have Barbara Kaler, Lisa Bennett, and Chelsea Supowit. And our panelists today who will be sharing their expertise with us is Teresa Harlan of Alliance for Felix Cove and Carlito Berg of Berg Associates. So I want to welcome you all. Thank you all for being here. I would like to get started by just letting you know that we have books and resource lists that are available on the Marin County Library website. This is an important topic, and some people want to dive deeper and get a broader perspective of some of the issues we'll be talking about. So you can go to marinlibrary.org and access those book lists, those resources, articles that are pertaining to the things we're talking about today. Okay, without further ado, Barbara, do you mind sharing a little bit about Serge Marin? And then I will share a little bit about our panelists today.
Sure, thanks, Rashida. So thank you for being here and welcome. And my name is Barbara Kaler, and I volunteer with Serge Marin. And Serge is a national network of groups and individuals that are working to bring more white people into the movement for racial justice. Serge has been in Marin since the summer of 2017, when a small but mighty group of white community members saw the need to join with local communities and leaders of color in working against the racial disparities in Marin County. Shortly after that, we began to offer a variety of learning and action opportunities. And there's a website and a newsletter that you can subscribe to for more information about those actions and events. One that it is ongoing every week is Action Hour on Mondays at noon. And we are 100% volunteer led. And one of the key and central, something that's key and central to Serge is Serge work is being in relationship with and following the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color led organizations. And Serge Marin partners with 3 Marin-based community organizations led by people of color: the Marin City Arts and Culture, Marin County Cooperation Team, and the Multicultural Center of Marin. And you can find more information about all of that on our website. So join us for a workshop, a book discussion, a rally, an action, so that together we can make a positive change in Marin and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists so we all get to know each other before we dive into our films for this afternoon's discussion. Teresa Harlan. Can someone highlight Teresa so we can see her? Teresa Harlan is the founder director for the Alliance for Felix Cove, which works to protect, restore, and rematriate the Felix family Tamalco Coast Miwok ancestral home at Point Reyes National Seashore. Teresa diligently calls out the historical and racial disparities of the long neglected history of the family's presence at Tamales Bay. They have over 10,000 years of history there, as it is viewed alongside the often more celebrated history of white ranching at Point Reyes National Seashore, which only makes up 160 years of history for perspective. She works to make Felix Cove a place where the full history of this place and her family are shared, where Indigenous folks can re-indigenize public and private lands, and where climate justice and ecological groups can build partnerships to enact change in the way that this land is used and remembered. You can learn more about her work at allianceforfelixcove.org. Welcome, Teresa.
Thank you.
The other person joining us as a panelist today is Carlito Berg, Carlito Berg. He is the managing director at Berg Holdings since 2018, and he leads Berg's real estate investment portfolio. Recently, Carlito has created several environmentally sustainable farm nodes that provide opportunities for low-income youth to get to know how to grow their own food, both traditionally and aquaponically, with the goal of having them bring their newfound skills back to their communities to alleviate the problems of food deserts in their barrios, as well as provide career opportunities in the agritourism industry. Carlito also builds affordable housing under California's low-income housing tax credit and other affordable housing programs. He is also a mentor to several young people and has a passion for education, practical skills, and empowering those around him. He also puts his BBA in business management, his BS in economics, and his fluent Spanish, which he gained through his multilingual Colombian mother's upbringing, to good use by staying active in his local Latina community. Welcome, Carlito Berg. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Lisa, can you start us off with land acknowledgement?
Sure, I'm happy to. At Surge, we like to take some time before we start any sort of official kinds of meetings to ground ourselves and acknowledge the land we're on and the history of the land we're on. So let me just start. As we begin this land acknowledgement, please take a moment to settle into your body, sensing your breath, your feet on the ground, and be connected to the earth. We're taking this moment today to acknowledge that this land has not been respected. The native people of the land have not been respected here and in other places. We are here because other people were forced to leave not that long ago. We are here because other people were forced to come here who did not want to come not long ago. We are here because for some of us, our ancestors were able to make choices that others were not allowed to make. We are on land that we did not honor, that we did not learn how to care for, and which we were not given. We took it by force, violence, and genocide. The people who honored and cared for this land and from whom this land was taken are the people who we have learned to call the Coast Miwok. They are still here. It is still their place, and we are guests here. So we have to think about how to be here like guests. We have to think about the voice inside us that says mine, and how to let that voice know that this place does not belong to us, that we have no right to be here. We want to own something because we don't know how to be in a place without grabbing it for ourselves. We haven't learned yet how to be in a place with grace. As we acknowledge the people who can't sit here because we are in their seats, I hope we will carry with us the willingness to think about how we can help each other let go of the tight grip we have on things, to give back what is not ours. It's scary to think about. We don't feel safe unless we can say, mine. That's why we are here. And so many of the people who love this land for 10,000 years are somewhere else. We honor them. We seek to undo some of what has been done. We hope to learn how to be respectful. Maybe learn this together this afternoon in the spirit of that respect. In particular, we encourage you to learn more about the Alliance for Felix Cove, and we'll put a link to this in the chat and we'll send it out to you afterward, which is a native-led effort to protect, restore, and rematriate the ancestral Coast Miwok/Tumulco homelands of the Felix family at Point Reyes National Seashore. And it will be an event to support this effort in November, so please go to the website to stay up to date, and please volunteer if needed, if asked, and support and donate as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And if anybody is interested in volunteering with Alliance for Felix Cove for that event in November, it's going to be a community kayak to commemorate the tool boats that were used by the Miwok, the Coast Miwoks out in our bay. And it's just a day of remembrance and of community spirit, but they are looking for volunteers, and you can email them at info@allianceforfelixcove.org. All right, without further ado, I think we're ready to begin our film. So the first film that we're going to be looking at is, it's called A California for Everyone. And it was created by California Community Builders. And then the next film that we're going to look at is Beyond Recognition. And these are short films. And then we will come back together and discuss this with our panelists. Hello. Thank you so much for sharing, for showing that, Lisa. Okay, I think we're ready to jump into our conversation with our panelists. But before I do that, I really do want to plug visiting Sogorea Te's website. When this video was created, Sogorea Te was kind of in its beginning stages. They have acquired a land trust, not just in Oakland, but I believe also in Vallejo. And they are using that land to grow traditional foods and medicines. They are working on using the land for housing for Indigenous folks so that they have a space in the lands where they traditionally have lived. So that is, it's just a great organization, and they are doing a lot of work to improve the communities where they live. So I do plug them. Please go check out their website. Without further ado, let me bring on Carlito Berg. Carlo, do you prefer Carlo or Carlito? Oh, are you muted?
One's fine.
Okay.
That's the one too.
You're a little choppy.
Okay. Let me try turning my video off in case that's better.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
And you prefer Carlito?
Yes.
Okay. And Teresa Harlan, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
I'm going to start my questions with you, Teresa. Can you tell us a little bit more about the work that Alliance for Felix Cove has been doing? What sparked the creation of this organization?
Yeah, thank you for asking. You know, I just want to thank you for that beautiful land acknowledgement. I really wish my mom and my aunts and uncles were here to hear that. It was beautiful. And so, you know, I'm here really as, you know, answering the call of our family's ancestors, the Felix family. My mom, my uncles, my aunts, they all grew up on this little house behind me on the western shores of Tomales Bay. And the Alliance for Felix Cove really originates from the eviction of my uncle and my grandpa in 1953 by the ranchers at Tomales, at Point Reyes National. Well, it was Point Reyes. There wasn't the seashore. And so that's the origin of it, is an actual eviction, which then made my uncle homeless, in so to speak words. I mean, he wasn't really, meaning that he lived with aunts, his sisters, my aunts. My grandpa came to live with us. But that is the origin, is our family's forced separation from this home, from this cove. The fact that, you know, at 62, you know, I have no experience of being at this home on the cove with my family. So the the origin of the Alliance for Felix Cove is really to bring awareness to the history of the Felix family of resiliency, to protect, restore, and reclaim our home, not just physically, but also spiritually, to bring healing to the intergenerational and cultural trauma from the experiences here. So that is what we're about. So when folks come up on this little house, either by kayaking or hiking at Point Reyes National Seashore, they'll know this history. But as of right now, today, you come across this house, there's no marking, there's nothing to tell you what this house, who it belongs to, and the history of the house. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And I do want to go into some of the ways that, this came about, and some of the, structural and systemic things that have been happening in the state of California for centuries. And, we'll go into that a little bit more deeply. My next question is for Carlito. Carlito, can you share a little bit about your experience as a developer who is seeking to build housing for low-income folks, for everyone? Can you walk us through what kind of your experiences have been as you've been trying to build homes for people?
Sure. So there's a couple things. So let me start. I think kind of we're a family business really at our core. And we started out being interested in affordable housing after my father came from Eastern Europe in the late 50s, and he slept in the trunk of a Model A Ford for many years because they just didn't have a place to stay. Then in tenement houses in Chicago and New York, and finally Los Angeles. And so when he started in his real estate career and looking at that, building places for people was really important for him on a emotional level. And he really passed that down, and we still have, parts of our family that, are to some degree housing insecure, given various lifestyles that they've chosen, and primarily in other countries. But currently, we're not, a big player in the space or anything like that, but we do build a good amount. I have about $120+ million in projects going on right now, mostly in Southern California. And the thing that I've been basically doing is doing ground leases with churches, religious institutions, hoping to do a couple with some indigenous tribes. My mom's side, she's a what's called a Bucaramanga Indian, and that's an Indian from the southeastern part of Colombia in the jungle there. And so it's always been fun to look at the different connections between South American Indians and North American Indians. I've always found that to be fun. But in general, I think the documentary hit on a couple things. CEQA has always been a big problem in developing any type of housing. We also develop market rate housing. And until in the last literally 24 months, the first time in this state's history, you can build a 100% affordable project and get a CEQA exemption and get a streamlined ministerial approval process. So that literally means that out of the entire, since CEQA was put in place by Ronald Reagan, it was impossible to go around it. Now we can actually go around it. And people don't know typically what that actually means. On a practical level, what that means is you save about $1 million doing your pre-development if someone sues you on a CEQA lawsuit. And then also you can speed up the process sometimes by as much as 24 months. So if you think all those things matter, because all the inputs to create housing matter in its end price. And if its end price is expensive, then the only type of housing that can be created is luxury housing. Because you can't make it pencil otherwise. Now, of course, if you're going to do subsidized housing, and we do a good amount of that, which is, subsidized by tax credit programs primarily, that's less of a concern. But then you can still get, prior to the last 24 months, you could still get sued for doing that. Now, if you do an SB 35 application, and use some other state laws to get around it, you can't. So I went to for instance, we had a project in the city of Inglewood on the second oldest historically Black church in the city, 5 blocks away from the giant SoFi Stadium development. So that church would have got wiped off the map. It was struggling financially. We partnered with them, did a ground lease, and then we submitted for permit about a month and a half ago, and they had to approve it. And we didn't have 50 planning commission hearings with them saying we need to alter the facade or cut down the height or do X, Y, and Z. This is going to be places for people on a half a block of land that the church already owns. That's adjacent to market rate apartments anyway. And the city had to give us our entitlements. So it's obviously improving. It's definitely better. But the processes and procedures of actually building affordable housing in this country and in California in particular are still so disparate and so difficult to do, because fundamentally if you're building almost any type of affordable housing, you need subsidy. And that can come in so many ways, and there's no standardized method by which you can get subsidy in this state. So TCAC and all the other HCD and all the other state organizations are beginning to do that, but still I can do an affordable project in Oakland that has a totally different way to go through, with a totally different process and procedures, financing, than one in Los Angeles, than one in Marin, just because every local jurisdiction is different. And that makes it more costly, more inefficient, and a pain. So that's kind of been my general experience. I hope that's helpful.
No, that is very helpful. That was something that struck me about the second video that we were watching is, I grew up in Oakland, and I was very aware of what was going on with the shell mound in Emeryville. And it confused me that, there doesn't seem to be a issue with creating giant parking structures and malls and IKEAs and things like that. Little to no pushback, little to no, issue with building those. But when it comes to building houses for people, which is such an enormous need, as you can see, as you look out and you just see tent city after tent city. Those projects are stopped and blocked at every turn. And even though the need is so very obvious and has been for such a long time, that was something that struck me. So hearing you talk through the issues that you've had building affordable houses and how there's a billion ways for those projects to be stopped, it does speak to the need for some kind of streamlining and standardization of the process. My hope is that as we continue to find new ways to create spaces for people, that those processes will begin to get put into place. Thank you for sharing that, Carlito. That was amazing. But this is a question that I actually have for both of you. Teresa, I'll start with you. Is it possible to build affordable housing while being stewards of the land? And what does that look like?
I think it is possible if there's intention and mindfulness about the checking in with the indigenous people of the area that you're planning to build. I mean, and becoming aware of it, that tribal people still live in the area, that we're not all gone. And I think about that, most tribes have, tribal historic preservation offices, and they have folks who go out and monitor when there are remains discovered. But also like with Karina's situation with Sagor Rete, that it wouldn't have taken much to partner with Sagor Rete to find a way to really plan something that would be honoring the ancestors and honoring and acknowledging what had been done. So I think, yes, definitely there's a way if there's interest, and if there is a humility and an acknowledgement that Indigenous people are still here and still tied to the very land that we sit on. I think about that every day living in Vallejo, you know, on the unceded lands of the Patwin people.
Thank you. I think that you make very good points about checking in with the original inhabitants and creating space for them. You know, I think a lot of Indigenous folks who have been here for thousands of years are facing eviction actually multiple times within their within the lifetime of a family. You know, they're being driven from land to land, and that the fact that that's still happening in 2022 is, I think, unconscionable. That's something that as a people with a force of will, that we can say no more of that, and let's find ways to incorporate and bring people in and create space for them in the midst of progress or creating open space. Okay, but around that open space, let's create space for the people who have been here. Thank you for sharing that, Teresa. Carlito, can you speak to the same question? Is it possible to build affordable housing while being a steward of the land? And you know, how would that look if you had a building project that needed building? How would you incorporate that?
Sure. I think there's a couple. I really view it through the lens of how history interacts with the built environment. And by what I mean by that is, you know, there is this whole manifest destiny idea, you know, in the 1800s as people were moving west. And, you know, of course, America at the time, you know, was taking the land from Mexico, who then had taken predominantly from people who had populated from Mexico, and large Spanish land grant families who, you know, had originally taken it from the Native Americans. So, you know, we have this sort of history, and the type of housing that people put was a single family home with a big ranch, right? And this is the 1800s. And then we get to a scenario post, then we have this kind of building boom in various cities all over America, where people are first discovering the real ideas of density, building with steel and so on, in the later part of the 1800s and the earlier part of the 1900s. And then after the Second World War, we begin to really get this idea about suburbs. And that started with the introduction of a place called Levittown. And of course, you had these covenants on title, which said, you know, no people of color are allowed to inhabit these particular type of houses. So like this suburban house that was invented with covenants on title that excluded people based on various races. So, so what I mean, this is kind of like a roundabout answer, but what I mean by that is, if you love the land and you love protecting open space and all of these other things that many of these environmentalists claim to do, then the exact wrong type of housing to build at scale would be single family suburban housing. So what I mean by that is, just on a practical level, you go build 40 units of housing, they're single family, they're an acre each, that's 40 acres. You could take that exact same footprint for 40 people, give them each, get large apartments, and with very, very reasonable density that most people will look at and say, this is not a big deal, put that on a single acre or even a half an acre. Right, so you literally the way you're building something can be literally 40 times more efficient. And then when you look at the associated greenhouse gas emissions and something called VMT, which is vehicle miles traveled, which is a standard that folks use at state level. You look at all of those things. If you really love the country, if you really love the environment, you naturally have to be for high density housing. And it's not to say that single family, housing is evil or anything like that. It's for sure not. It's just a type of housing. But if you're really, like I'm a country boy, I love the country, and I want to protect, the only way to protect the country really is to do urban infill projects and densify the city. So to me, that's how I view it, and it's for sure possible to do. And I do it every day. So
there's two things that you said that I kind of want to highlight and pull out. Is the first thing is the idea that we need to take the whole of what it means when we build single unit homes for people. All of us have been out on the roads, and we have seen just kind of what a traffic nightmare we are living in here in the Bay Area. I personally cannot afford to live in Marin. I wish I could, but I can't. So I live in Contra Costa, and I commute every day. Like how many greenhouse gases am I spewing into the air just so that I can work, so that I can continue to live and have a place to live, and not be in a tent city? These are the things that we need to take into consideration when we're talking about no new houses, no new houses. How much of the environment are we destroying by keeping housing so limited when people need to live? People need places to live. They need to preferably live close to where they work if they're going to be able to not spew those greenhouse gases into the sky. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight and pull out is kind of the history that you're bringing up. We, in previous Demystifying Affordable Housing events, we've talked about Levittown and talked about kind of the social engineering that was done by deciding who gets to live where and who does not get to live in certain areas, and the ways that that plays into a lot of some of the modern ways of thinking about housing and about building and about not in my backyard. That attitude actually has a historical context. It didn't spring out of nowhere. That was definitely a place that is a new turn of phrase for an old concept, which we can get into. And actually, I'm going to kind of dive into that with my next question. In a lot of ways, we are seeing kind of a redux of colonialism. And I'm speaking specifically about the idea that there is a very small select group of people who are deciding who gets to live in which places. How do you see that being perpetuated today? Teresa, I know you started to share a little bit about your family story. We would love to hear more about that. And then I'll direct that question to Carlito. Teresa?
Yeah, thanks. I changed my background picture to show a photograph of my grandmother, my mom's mom, Bertha Felix Campili, and you can see the shed and the barn behind her. And I don't want to lose this one thought that I got from Carlito, is that, high density housing, traditionally folks lived in villages. My great grandfather built the house and built two houses over the next cove. And so the family lived as extended family. My grandma Bertha and her sister Perfecta raised their families together. And I think that, the high density housing that we're hearing about, if there was the inclusion of a garden, some sustainable regenerative elements in which the families who live in these high density housing can then also learn how to live and grow their own food and teach that to the kids, which usually kind of sometimes gets taught at schools or whatever. But I mean, that is, something that just came to me listening to Carlito. And then, going back to your question about who gets to live where, well, obviously my family didn't get to live in their ancestral lands, because in the 60s, all this area along Tamales Bay was being thought about as land development. And so the people who created the Point Reyes National Seashore were in a rush to beat all the land development work that was starting to go on, and ranchers were selling their land for housing, for single family home development. And so, you know, that when my grandmother died, the rancher, they're not out there anymore. Turney and Lundgren, who owned K Ranch, said, well, you know, basically this is what my mom had heard through the grapevine, to use a cliche, that, you know, now that the old lady has died, they want the land. And as Karina mentioned in her film, everything grew up around this family. And so this family had lived here for thousands and thousands of years ancestrally. So there is no deed, there's no property tax records. And so when my uncle fought the eviction, he had no paper documentation, only oral history to say that the family lived here when San Francisco was known as Yerba Buena. And so, you know, during the Mexican period. So, you know, my uncle's attorney, who was at the time Marin County's district attorney, William Wysick, who took this case as a pro bono, said everybody in the court knew that the family predated the ranchers. But California laws, real estate laws, were written not to protect indigenous land rights, but those of the privileged. So, so yeah, all of this, you know, is so the story of California, the story of California Indian people, the story of my family's is all over, from the state to all throughout the United States, of folks who are pushed to the margins. And the other thing I just wanted to bring up quickly is that when we think about land and we think about home and where we live, our Western attitude is this house that we live in. And so people take pictures of their living room, their great room, whatever. But in our family album, all of the photographs are outside. That land, the cove, the hills, they were considered home. And so, you know, there's a whole difference of how we live. Is the home includes the land, the out. So, so anyway, quickly, just touching on all those things and wanting not to forget my what Carlito brought to mind. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Two things that I want to pull out from what you were saying. The first is when we talk about, you know, having a low carbon footprint, the way your family was living was a perfect example of wonderful green living. So you have a small structure that is for sleeping and cooking and for getting out of the elements, but most of your time and living space is outside, and that is shared by all. So small dwellings, big outdoor living areas, that is shared by all. That is completely sustainable. That is completely reproducible. You know, that would have little to no impact on the natural world around us, but our insistence on individuals gaining more has moved us away from that. Big house, big land, 2 to 4 people living on, you know, on that land, consuming a ton of resources for landscaping and things like that. And nobody else is able to use that land for anything else. That is the essence of being poor stewards of the land. So it's interesting to just see that historical, you know, the answer is right in front of us. The answer to our troubles is right in front of us, but it's, you know, the question is, do we have the will to grasp it, to put it into motion? The other thing that I wanted to pull out is you mentioned, you know, Yerba Buena, and just the way that things have progressed. And the reason why I asked that question is because I was doing a historical audit of California a few years ago, And I was learning about the land grants that the Catholic Church was giving to the Spanish conquistadors. And, it's basically, clergymen, an ocean away, carving up the land, having never seen it, giving those land grants to their, favorites, their political favorites, who then come over and build giant ranches. The people who were originally here were literally hunted. They were hunted. They were hunted and driven onto missions to work for free. And that is an ongoing history. That is the root of kind of our housing policy here in California. and it feels like in a lot of ways, too much of the negative aspects of that have remained and been codified as law, and not enough reform has happened to ensure that those wrongs are corrected. So I appreciate you sharing kind of how your family interacted with that and came up against that with the ways that, kind of this legal system that has nothing to do with the reality of who is actually there, and does not take them into account, creates a law that just erases them from their place and from history, which I'm glad that your organization is working to correct that. So my next question, Carlito, do you have any take on that? Kind of, I know you started to speak on that. Can you talk more about the way that you see like colonialism kind of rearing its head, and how does that manifest itself as you're looking at, interacting with the legal system and getting things built, getting dwellings built for people?
I think with colonialism, there's this idea that it's kind of a rules for thee, not for me type thing, because there's this whole idea that that people should be able to build on the land that they own or do what they want with the land, is the common thing people say. And then there's this other idea, which is really important, that obviously you have neighbors and things need to be taken into consideration. So you need to make processes to consider those things. But if either of those parties is not negotiating in good faith and says, I want to do what I want to do, and the other person says, okay, well, then that what you want to do makes something not feasible, and they know that, and they do that anyway, then it becomes very difficult to have constructive dialogue around what that actually means. And so there's this weird thing where NIMBYs and others say, we were here first. We bought a home in 1970 and it was $70,000. And through looking at our own economic incentives of making housing intentionally scarce, we've made ourselves rich. Right. And so what does that actually mean? If a working year is 2,080 hours, and you have homes in Marin in the last year, I think on average they've appreciated anywhere from 150 to 300,000 on average during the pandemic, right? So like that's basically like having a job, right? A full-time job, and you've done that, and you did that through no fault of your own or no benefit or whatever the case may be. So it's like getting paid 50 plus bucks an hour for doing nothing. And that's why people say, hey, there's this weird thing where it's like, hey, we have these homes. We don't want people to build more homes because that would drive the price of our homes down. So you create this inbred, what would you call it? Economic incentive, which then people have to go fight against. And then you have the law rigged in one favor for one type of people, for one type of housing. And a very easy way to see that is like, you can look at Paris, for instance, and it's, 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers. Everyone, all these Americans go to Paris or Madrid or all these other places, and they say, wow, look at the built environment, it's beautiful. Wouldn't that be nice if things could happen here? If you could walk to a coffee store instead of taking a car, if you could get on public transit, if you had retail below places where people could live. This is not to say every type of building is perfect. It's absolutely not. But at the same time, most of the things that people find to be a nice way to live in other places where Americans go and visit are actually illegal in their own communities to build. So, I think that's kind of the history of colonialism to some degree.
I think that you're making a really excellent points, that it's not as if we don't know what to do. There's models of affordable housing being delivered to the people in various places all over the world, but it's not something that is reproducible by law here. So we're kind of stuck with the old way of doing things. And one of the points that I want to pull out is you talking about creating enforced scarcity. A lot of times when we talk about, oh, I don't want my house value to go down, well, it's high. It's inflated and it's artificial. It's artificially valuable because you've made it so that nobody else can build. So there's, of course, high demand, which means high prices. And maybe there are ways that we can create a legal space where that is not permissible. It shouldn't be allowable for people to create space and to shut people out of being able to live in a home rather than on the streets, so that my house value stays high. That's if we're talking in terms of big business, that's a monopoly, that's an oligarchy, and that's not something that should be allowed when it goes down to the granular level of individuals. So that really, really excellent points you're bringing out there. When we think about how to honor and preserve open space while addressing the need to provide shelter for the people who work here and live here, what should we be prioritizing or weighting? And I'm going to ask this as a developer and as someone whose families were original and are original inhabitants of the land. Carlito, I'm going to start with you on that. What things should we focus on as we are starting to look for solutions to this problem?
Could you be a little more specific in what are you talking about? Specific natural resources? Are you talking about laws? Are you talking about geographic considerations? Should we build on hills? Should we not? What?
So what I'm asking is, as we're looking for housing solutions, we're looking to fix the problem of not enough housing for people, but we also want to keep in mind the need for nature to surround us, the need for, none of us want to live in a concrete wasteland.
Absolutely.
So how do we hold both of those things? When we're thinking about solutions, what things should we prioritize as we're trying to hold nature and space for people in the same hands? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So there's this idea that, like you said, like there's a concrete jungle and the city has to be a concrete jungle, right? Right. And that's historically been the case when you do high density development and you need to build with concrete, which is one of the least environmentally friendly building technologies in terms of embodied carbon and greenhouse gas, because it has very good load compression, very poor shear strength. So you can build stuff that's tall because obviously you're putting a lot of load on it with steel that's intermixed, and do something called a post-tension slab, which is something that every high-rise has. Now we're having, I think technology really is the thing that makes it possible to do things differently than have been done in the past. So one example might be a technology like cross-laminated timber. And so that's wood, which is a renewable resource and can be managed as such. That's put together in stacks, glued together, and then they become beams. And so you can actually build skyscrapers out of wood that actually perform better than skyscrapers that are made of concrete and steel. So you have, there's type 1 through 5 in different constructions, type 1 being concrete and steel, and type 5 being traditional wood frame, like a regular single family house is, with studs 16 inches on center. So when you get into like how things are actually constructed, to me, that's where you get the most benefit to a question like that. You can use technology to make things better. I think there should be codifications and laws, and there actually already are to some degree. When you build affordable housing in California under the LIHTC program, you have to install solar panels. You have to make there's certain STC ratings, there's certain R values. These are all building science things that talk about how sound transfers, how heat transfers through a building. And you should make something ideally that's a neutral or negative carbon structure. And obviously the technology is not totally there yet, but it's going to be. And in every one of our developments, we put in as much of that as we possibly can. And the good thing about affordable housing development is because it's subsidized through tax credits, you're intentionally not trying to make it cash flow. You're intentionally trying to just make it barely scrape by. You're not trying to make money off it like you are in the same way with market rate housing. You have an ability through manipulating the capital stack, through getting more debt, less debt, more tax credit equity, less equity, to then pay for all those stuff, and that a traditional development likely would not be able to do. So hopefully that helps with some of the questions without being too esoteric.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I see where you're going as far as creating houses that are green to begin with. And I think also incorporating, and we talked about this before, incorporating nature. Teresa mentioned, land that is used for all to grow food, to grow medicine, to incorporate nature and allow nature to move into our living spaces and become part of our living spaces. I think that is going to be key moving forward. If all of us shared a front yard and all of us shared our backyard and had dwellings that fit our family and not, an army, those are, I think, good steps towards getting towards a solution. Thank you for sharing that, Carlito.
Absolutely. I would just Google if anyone's interested in this solar punk. It's the aesthetic you're describing. It's this it's like a city that has a ton of green space, that has food that's replicatable within the city itself, whether aquaponically or otherwise. And people are looking at that across the country and the world right now.
I am definitely going to check that out because that sounds amazing. Teresa, same question to you. Are there ways to incorporate the natural world with kind of this need for housing for all? And is there a way to, what would we need to prioritize? What's the main thing we should focus on if we're going to bring those two things together?
Thanks for asking. I would prioritize looking at the land as a living entity, as a living being, the very land and the water that is going into the materials as living beings, as Native people. And one thing that I would also recommend or urge is that create beautiful living spaces for low-income housing, like the beautiful living spaces that people have, like on Inverness Ridge or in Point Reyes or in Tamales. All of these folks that have these beautiful views make something that is aesthetically rich and dimensional for families, and make them sustainable and regenerative, so that there's shared outdoor space, shared gardens.
Mm.
You know, I had family that lived in the projects in the city, and those are just cement blocks,
Right.
you know, nothing friendly or engaging. So that's what I would, and I absolutely acknowledge the Native people more than just a name, you know, really engage with Native people, get to know them, bring them to the site. And you know, I think there could be some beautiful partnerships, and talk with groups that, like, locally we have the Cultural Conservancy, and Sagor Rete and Ramatosh Ohlone Association that have beautiful gardens, urban gardens. And, you know, we saw in the film, you know, that's the excitement and the love you see when people are really utilizing outdoor space and utilizing the land, the water as living entities.
And I love what you're saying there. And I think that's something that's often been missing, is that we often forget that we're interdependent with the land, that we're connected to the land, that if the land is doing well, we're doing well. When the land is not doing well, we're not doing well. And so when we build, instead of thinking it as, you know, this is just a slab that we're building on, no, this is a living biome that we're building our living biomes on top of. So, like, let's incorporate that and have that be a part of the plan. Another point that you made was kind of like the cement blocks. You know, in previous events for demystifying affordable housing through a racial justice lens, we discussed those blocks are ugly and unfriendly by design, because they were made to keep Black, Brown, Indigenous people in. So it's like, you know, we get the suburban homes with the lush rolling grass. Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, you get the, you know, cement slabs, unfriendly. And as soon as we build them, we're going to stop taking care of them. So they just crumble down around you. And then we can demolish them and make more single family dwellings as we grow. And historically, that is a pattern that has been repeated throughout the United States. And I think we're all suffering for that. I think the tent cities that we see as we drive along and as we walk along, they are a direct result of that being codified and written into the law. So now we need to look at codifying and writing it out of the law, and writing more of these, what did you call it? Urban punk? More initiatives like that, where we see the land being incorporated into our building spaces. Okay, a few more minutes. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A from our audience. I would really love, and they touched on this in the video by California for All, that there is a big difference between kind of the way that the American conservation movements have grown up and developed versus the ways in which Indigenous, and in other videos that I've watched and books that I've read, and the ways in which farmers of color have traditionally used the land. That there's a difference between, you know, those different conservation movements. Can you speak to, Teresa, I'm going to start with you. Can you speak to some of the differences that you see between kind of mainstream idea of conservation and the ideas of conservation that are adopted and held by Indigenous people and by people of color?
Well, I'll say, as Indigenous people, their conservationism didn't exist. I mean, conservationism is, you know, the history of conservationism comes out of the fact that, you know, in the East, the dominant society had built up the land so much and degraded it that there no longer was outside beauty, natural elements. And so then people wanted to save these areas like Yellowstone Park, Glacier National Park, save these spaces from development for themselves,
Right.
so that they could then, you know, have these aesthetic moments of relating to natural beauty. And then of course the commercialism, you know, the developers who were like, oh, tourism, you know, they're going to need hotels, they're going to need restaurants, they're going to need, you know, mementos, souvenir shops. You know, there's an angle of money making for us here. But in the meantime, this is all built on driving out the native people. So conservationism is about protecting and restoring natural elements without the people. So, you know, the photograph behind me would be like this beautiful black and white of Tomales Bay, that you just erased my grandma, the cows, the barns, the corrals, the sheds. That's the idea of conservationism. So that, you know, for those of us who live in urban areas and who can afford, you know, can afford a Yellowstone summer vacation, a Yosemite vacation. And, you know, I just want to bring up Point Reyes National Seashore was created to give a national park experience to families in the Bay Area, communities of color, the experience of a national park without the expense of Yellowstone and Yosemite. That's why there's no fee. And the creators of the national park actually had workshops with communities of color in the Bay Area to ask them what they wanted. So conservationism is something that, you know, is rewilding, you know, without, you know, some people believe without any intervention from human hands. Whereas indigenous science, indigenous principles is all about human intervention, not intervention, but human stewardship of the lands, of the nurturing of the plants and the grasses, so that the animals can have a healthy source of food. And so, you know, that animals that will eventually become food, or the plant life that eventually will become food, or you'll use for your living, for your clothing or your housing. So there is no conservationism for Native people in that respect, because conservation is what we have now. We have national parks with, you know, no Native people.
That really puts me in mind of, it's a kind of a Disneyland that's created, where you just chunk off this piece of land and then it's for recreation, and then you have the souvenir shop and the hotel on the edges of it, and nobody can use that land for anything else. And you charge admission, right? Those of us who have tried to do the lottery to get into Yosemite know what that's like. What would it look like if humans are interacting with the land in a way that is healthy and is balanced, and not either blocking things off so nobody can touch it, while, you know, we have tent cities all around it, or versus, you know, having land that is there that all of us are using well, and we are giving to the land and the land is giving to us, and there's a cyclical thing happening there. That's I think a really good image. Like, which do we want? Where do we want our future to go? And I definitely can see some of the ways that Indigenous conservation allows for space for people as well as for nature. Thank you so much, Teresa. Carlito, same question to you. How would you describe, what would you say is your experience with conservationism, and how would you say your view of conservationism looks different from perhaps mainstream, what we usually think of as conservationism?
Thing that Teresa said, that was so spot on. You know, conservationism, so there's this, it's kind of a pernicious idea that you know, humans shouldn't be around. It's almost like we want to some degree, like, suicide our own species, because we're we're evil, you know, we're just a parasite on the world. You hear about all of this sort of this rhetoric. But the reality is that if we can live in concert with the world in a way that's beautiful and sustainable from every perspective, not just from a built environment perspective, but also from an economic perspective, also from a perspective of having families be together, not just having, you know, casting one person out of the family so they can go and, you know, live in a studio apartment in LA because that's the only thing that they can afford, and or whatever the case may be. We have this idea that below market rate or quote unquote affordable housing is a solution to that, and it's really not. To me, you know, if you look at, there's this idea that cities, and I've done projects like this where cities will donate to us a piece of land and then we'll build it for them and then have a covenant that says we're going to operate affordable housing on this for whatever it is, 65 years, 99 years, whatever the case may be. But it would be much better if cities in general were better capitalized, could then, and had the skills to do this, which would only get through property tax revenue, typically from single family homes. But we can't really do that because of Prop 13. But if people were actually able to, on a large public scale, own the land and then have there be ground leases underneath it where affordable housing developers could build. I've done a good amount of that, and that tends to be a great solution because you get the affordable housing as it sits. You get to the zoning and other rules. That's the proper place for them to say, hey, we want you to put in this much green space. We want you to have this type of solar array. We want you to have this type of food production on site. We want you to have these things that are going to make the city's life better, the residents better, all this stuff. That's the proper place for zoning to regulate that, as opposed to saying you can't put this type of housing there or that type of housing there. And we decided that in 1980, and we're just going to keep it the same way since then. So that's all I have to say about that.
That's I think a perfect way to put that. Lisa is reminding me that Golden Gate Village has kind of incorporated a lot of those ideas of they're right now seeking to have a conservancy of the land where the people own it, and then they are able to bring builders on and they can lay out, this is what we want to see on this land. We want to see affordable houses. We want it to be beautiful. We want it to be incorporated with the natural environment. We want our historical places and our places of worship preserved, so that there is a way that the people are kind of deciding that this space is going to be used for the benefit of all. It is owned by all and is used for the benefit of all, versus this is my land, I'll do what I want on it, and you know, you'll just have to deal with it, which is kind of our current model of doing things. And I know that Sogareate, I'm probably butchering how I'm saying that, they're also doing things like that. They're taking a land trust and then using that for the benefit of their communities, preserving the land, using it as a green space to grow things for the community where these places are, and in that way kind of incorporating the living land back into the life of the community. So you know, excellent. I think that's an excellent breakdown. We are now going to open it up for questions. I had one question earlier from Blanca, who was asking about the term NIMBY. She was asking if that's a California term or where did that come from? NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. It is not a California term. It's a term that's used, it has become popular very recently, but it's a term that's used all over the country. And it's speaking to a specific mindset of, yeah, sure, we do need more housing. Yes, sure, we do need, you know, a garbage dump. We need places for these things. We need sewage treatment plants, but I just don't want it in my backyard. The problem is that if everybody says that, then those things don't get built, even though we need them. And so what you end up with is an environmental disaster where, okay, there's no housing. So we've got tent cities where people are living on the street. There's no garbage dumps, so people are just throwing garbage everywhere. There's no water treatment plants, so people are just chucking things out the window. So when you have that persistent, not in my backyard, and not versus our community needs this, let's find solutions for finding places for these things, it's oftentimes a roadblock without solutions. And so that's why we're kind of bringing in that attitude and the set of actions that come with that attitude. And we're highlighting that and showing that that is definitely a barrier to affordable housing. Lisa, can you start reading out, or Chelsea or Barbara, can you read out some of the other questions that we're getting in the chat?
I'm actually not seeing a lot of questions, so I sent you one of my own.
Okay. What is the Native approach to understanding home ownership? So that's a really interesting question. So we have like this idea of home ownership that is very European, Western European, where you own this plot of land. I think Carlito touched on that, where you have this like big haciendas, you know, and then just a ranch and tons of cows, and California's kind of emulated that, you know, perhaps in smaller scale. Can you give us some sense of how home ownership looks from an Indigenous perspective? Knowing that you speak as an individual, we're not asking you to share for your entire people group, but
yeah, there's thank you for that. There's so many different people, nations, and out there that I can only speak as an individual. You know, and people, I know when people start hearing land backs, sometimes folks get really nervous and they'll say, well, do you want that in your, you know, you want to give your house back? And it's kind of like, land back movement is not about turning over individual ownership of land. And I think that ownership of land, you didn't own the land, you know, and from what I have learned from reading, what I've learned from listening to elders speak, you didn't own the land, you were part of it. It was your relative. So you tended it, you took care of it, you stewarded it, you know, but as Native people, home ownership is very complicated, especially for folks when you think about the history of the development of reservations, in which people lived in their homes, lived in what they knew as home, and then forcibly moved to areas and told, this is where you live. And then, you know, I'm going to fast track through history. Some reservations have Bureau of Indian Affairs housing, HUD housing, which are small, modest homes. So that's your home that you've been assigned to, or that's the home. But it's so different than the home. Like, for instance, you know, my blood is Kiowa and Jemez Pueblo from New Mexico. So like my grandmother on my birth side, so folks may not know that I'm adopted. And so my adopted mom was Coast Miwok, but my birth mom who gave birth to me is from New Mexico. But my grandmother in New Mexico could build her own home out of adobe. And, you know, so you might build a home for your family to live in, but there wasn't like, this plot is mine and you can't drive on this road. And so, but as we have, we're just like everybody else. I own a home. Some of us own homes. Some of us still live in the land sites where our families are from. So it has different meanings, and it has changed because of colonialism and because of what has been forced on us to know as home. So my husband is Seminole, And so his home ancestrally is from Florida, but because of the forced removal of Seminole people to Oklahoma, Oklahoma was supposed to be the Indian territory that, Native people were all gonna get to live there. And that didn't work out because of the Sooners, right? They opened up the land. But anyway, so the whole idea of Indigenous home ownership is so complicated and has so much history that, it's a discussion in and of itself. It's not simple at all. And it really depends on what part of the country you're from. But the one thing I do know is that, not many Native people can own their own home. I was a renter until my 40s. It wasn't like I owned a home, straight out of college. So there's all these different ideas and about home ownership. So yeah, I know that was like all over, but it's just because it's a loaded question. It's a very good question. So I thank the person for asking that question, but like so much is worrying in my mind about history, forced removal, HUD housing, land trusts and land back, and our version of home, which, is, it was, that home was built by our great grandpa using the methods that they learned that was passed down from missions, from being the slave labor from the Mexican ranchos and the and the American ranches. So even our little house on the Cove is sometimes loaded because people will look at it and say, well, that's not someone's idea of what an Indigenous home is, because it's Western built. But those modes of construction were learned, and why wouldn't an Indigenous family use the most modern technology to live and create homes for themselves? But yeah, we didn't get to have ownership of home ownership, obviously,
Right.
because that's how we got evicted. So it works for some, it doesn't work. It didn't work for us as my family, my Coast Miwok family, our Indigenous family from Tomales Bay or Tomalco. We weren't allowed to have home ownership. It wasn't recognized for us.
I think that's you're bringing up so many points, and I understand how complicated that is, and the reason why you can't afford to own your own home for so long is because, again, it was decided that this family can have lands, we're giving it away, and they're able to build that generational wealth. But this family, not so much. We'll move you here, and then we'll move you here, and maybe we might capture you and force you to work for us for free. So the ability to build wealth, to live on your own land, is just not. It's not feasible. I understand this is a very complex issue, and it does incorporate history. It incorporates law. It incorporates the socioeconomic decisions that were made on us, against us, and then us trying to deal with it and make sense of it all. It can be very overwhelming. I appreciate you sharing that with us, though. I have another question in the chat from Ali. In one of the videos, there was a comment about how environmentalists are too focused on clear air, water, and not on healthy people. I believe that those two are not mutually exclusive and that the environment actively impacts people's health. Is there an effort to help with educating people about that? And also, how can I be concerned about helping the environment without giving the impression that I am dismissing the health of individuals in a community? That's a great question. Carlito, do you want to take a swing for that? Is there a way to incorporate what is good about the conservation, what we think of as mainstream conservation movement, into the needs of the people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is of course. You know, they have to go along with each other. You can't you could have all the all the high density housing in the world, and you know, if the water you're drinking is like Flint, Michigan, then you're gonna have a problem. Like this is it's obviously. So I think the thing that's most consequential, you know, I certainly am an environmentalist, member of the Sierra Club, all that good stuff, but um but the thing is when people weaponize environmentalism to not actually be, you know, I think if people actually look at a situation and they're acting in good faith, I almost never see any issues. It's when, you know, you have an anonymous CEQA lawsuit from someone who's claiming to be the friends of XYZ creek, ocean, tree, and you're going to take, you know, you may take down, and then they're not going to be creative, right? So you may have 5 trees you need to take down for 100 families to live in a place for, you know, the next 70 years. You know, that's an appropriate place to say you need to take those trees and double the replanting in another place. Or you need to do X, Y, and Z on your site to mitigate for that. Fundamentally, those things are almost all mitigatable. And there are some things that aren't mitigatable. Like you cannot build, like we have you know, like you just can't build certain things in certain places. Like that's also a reality too. You know, but we should always be looking at, you know, arguing in good faith, saying how can we do the most of both at the same time.
Right. I think that is a really good point. And I think, Allie, you make an excellent point there, and that it is important to preserve our water supply. It is important to preserve, you know, our clean air, and to speak about, you know, sustainable fishing and things like that, and have that be like, you know, as Teresa's saying, we need to look at how we're interacting with the land, and are we seeing the land as a living thing as we're, you know, building homes for people. If it's, you know, and Carlito, you brought this out, if there's bad faith of somebody just trying to make as much money as possible without concern for the people who are being displaced and the nature that is being ruined, that should be called out. And, you know, I feel like, are there ways we can reform CEQA so that truly the environment is protected and not weird shadow financial interests, which is currently kind of what is happening. That I think that was really chilling to see. You know, I'm a builder. I don't like the fact that, you know, these other builders are making more money than me, so I'm just going to file a bunch of CEQA lawsuits against them. If the law is able to be used that way, then it's a bad law, and we need to look at reforming that. And I think that that is something that, you know, just because it has environmental in the title doesn't mean that it's actually good for the environment. Because as we see, if you displace people and they become homeless, and this is very heavy on my mind because our last event was on the homelessness crisis, then that's not good for the environment either. We are connected to the land. If you displace people, then the land will suffer for that. It's not environmental to keep people out of homes.
Yeah.
So
I would just add super quickly, you know, there's this great school in the Bay Area called UC Berkeley, and it graduates more people of color and more people from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds than the entire Ivy League every year. So, you know, it's a great school, but when they want to go build housing for their students, so they can literally have thousands of more people from disadvantaged backgrounds who are really smart, actually get a great education at Berkeley, there's a bunch of local organizations that say, no, we don't want you to do that. And then they weaponize CEQA and use it for that purpose. So, you know, there's so much with people not acting in good faith. If all you did was reform CEQA to just say you had to pay your own attorney's fees, you can't get prevailing party, you can't do it anonymously, and then you can't, and then you also can't do multiple rounds, you can't do double jeopardy, that would fix probably 99% of the problems with that law.
wow. This seems like such a simple solution to the problem. It makes you wonder why it hasn't been done yet. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. If there are other questions, okay, I'm seeing this one from Mary. Justice is key to many contemporary climate environmental activists. How might this conversation include environmentalists? Teresa, do you want to take a swing at that? How would you like to see environmentalists engage in this conversation?
Well, I am engaged with the environmentalists in Marin County, especially around Point Reyes National Seashore, because, you know, ranching from archaeological standpoint has been noted to, you know, at Point Reyes National Seashore to degrade sites. And then we know about the bacterial runoff from dairy cattle into freshwater lagoons of places that people, you know, don't realize, you know, when they wade into the waters at Abbott's Lagoon, or that, you know, that it's contaminated from runoff. So, you know, there is mutual interest in with the Alliance for Felix Cove and environmental groups like Resource Renewal Institute and Centers for Biological Diversity in Western Watersheds at Point Reyes National Seashore. So, and I'm really glad that, you know, folks from these groups are very welcoming and to hear the Native voices and Native thoughts. But I know that it isn't always alliances everywhere, and even with these same groups in different parts of the state or different parts of the country. But I know that the Sierra Club has sponsored discussions regarding land back movements last year or earlier this year to try to build a shared understanding. So I do work with local environmental groups.
That's wonderful. Just hearing you speak, it reminds me of a saying that we have nothing about us without us. So if a decision is going to be made, whether that be an environmental conservation decision or a building decision, the people who are going to be most impacted by that should be able to speak into that. And usually when we're talking about people of color, they're the ones who have historically been left out of those conversations. So I think it is there needs to be a reaching out from environmental groups to Indigenous folks. And when there is, you know, and maybe some questions asked, how would you like to see this land being used? How do you think this land can be better used? Do our environmental initiatives connect with the way the land was originally used? So like have that, you know, back and forth and drawing in of the people who have been shut out of the conversation. I have one last question, so I think we're going to close out with this. We've got 5 minutes left, 6 minutes. Do you have a preferred reparation for the harm done to Indigenous people due to the land theft and violation of treaties with Indigenous people? Teresa, I'm going to start with you. Carlito, I'm also going to ask the last two questions to you as well. What would you like to see, Teresa? And again, this is from your perspective, your opinion. What is a way that we can start to give back to the people who have been taken from?
I think it had, I will say, I started to say, I think locally, but I also think nationally. So I, you know, like Karina with Sagar Rete with their land trust, folks who would like to support the Alliance for Felix Cove, you know, in our work we're the only entity that is working to protect this little house that was built in the late 1800s. No one else is trying to protect it. No one else is calling attention to it. So, you know, supporting, I think, local Native groups in Marin County. Folks who want to support us can go to our website. We're also, as you mentioned, going to have this Tule Canoe event in November where it's re-indigenizing Tamauliwa, bringing our relatives back to Tamales Bay. And so we're hoping to have it at Heart's Desire Beach. And so we'll need volunteers. So, you know, if folks want to get involved with us, you know, definitely. But I think it's also kind of like realizing what makes the most meaning to you as an individual.
Mhm.
You know, does honoring the ancestors and honoring the land mean you get involved with a group like Karina's group, or a group like our group, or a national movement? You know, maybe it means thinking about how you even utilize your own property. You know, how do you is your yard sustainable? You know, do you have a place for the bees and the butterflies and all the good things to which we can have a healthy, diverse environment? But yeah, I think reparations, you know, there's lots of land reparations going on. Not lots, I shouldn't say it that way. It's my lazy way of talking. I apologize. But there is a discussion of reparations. There's great movements of the land that has been given back to Native people up north, the renaming of Sumig, Petrick's Point State Park. I think reparations might even mean starting with being open-minded and considering what the possibilities are. You know, supporting things that that acknowledge the ancestors, that acknowledge our relationship. Like in the film, we all have a relationship to land. It's not just Native people, Indigenous people. We all have, you know, relationships to land. So finding that and developing that. And not to be afraid of it. It doesn't mean that folks are going to come in and occupy your backyard.
That's great. I think that you brought up so many points. I know, I think advocacy should be a part of that. An acknowledgement that the land was taken, that's the first step. And then the next step is to advocate where you see movements or you see people fighting to preserve, you know, when we have those, you know, no DPAL movements happening, and people are struggling with these entities that are seeking to make a profit over the lives of people, over their well-being, to advocate for people of color, to advocate for Indigenous people. I know Sogorea Te has, they say, give shumi. That's, you know, we pay taxes on every parcel of land. Say for my land, I would give shumi to, you know, their organization so that they can purchase land for their people and for their goal is to have many small areas that of land that has been re-indigenized, where, you know, native medicines and foods are grown, where housing for people who have been displaced is built, and it benefits the entire community. So, you know, maybe you give a few dollars every month, and that's your acknowledgement that you're living on borrowed land, and that you are saying, thank you for letting me take this space and let me contribute to your community as you contribute to mine. So there's that give and take. And this is the last, Carlito, I'm going to put these two questions to you. Is there a way to partner with environmentalists? And do you think that there are ways that land can be used to be given back as in reparation for land that has been taken?
Yeah, I think there's definitely ways to do both. So, you know, my perspective is colored by a variety of different things. Really, it's from being in the business community for a long time and looking at the idea about residual land value. And that's this idea that if any piece of land is only valued two different ways fundamentally. One is what other people are willing to pay for it, or comparables. And then the other is residual land value, which is how much money do you have to put in to build X, Y, or Z? And then of that whole return structure, what portion of that is the land, essentially. So in the first situation where you have comparables, the reparation for land is very difficult because people are paying whatever they're paying. It has no cash flow fundamentally associated with it. It's hard to value.
Right.
But there are models internationally and nationally that are really fascinating, having to do with repatriating native land, or having native people buy a piece of land, reincorporate it legally into their own nation, and then be able to control it legally. And by that, there's probably the biggest example of that. I was talking with some colleagues up in BC. There's this development that's about 10.5 acres in Canada, in Vancouver, and they want to build 1,200 units of affordable housing and 6,000 units of other housing. They'd be the first Squamish native skyscrapers in the world. And so basically what they said was, hey, this is our land. We get to use it how we want to use it. And so there are opportunities to partner with folks to actually create value in that land by having there be affordable housing for people, Indigenous people who, may have historic homelessness issues or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And so to me, one of the best ways currently to look at the concept of reparations is the idea that that rules on given pieces of land can be different depending on who owns it. And so if the rules that the native local jurisdiction puts in place give that land significantly more value, then they should be able to benefit from that in a way that makes them economically sustainable for the long term.
I really like that model, and I feel like a lot of the organizations that we're talking about are starting to adopt at least aspects of that, where you're kind of working within the system, but you are doing it for the good of all. Like having this land that is uplifting people who have been historically pressed down, it benefits everyone. The land is more healthy, the people are more healthy, the environment is more healthy, but in a lot of ways you kind of have to almost work around our current laws here in the United States and in California. Our hope is that as we reform these exclusionary laws, that more people will be able to build what they need and do that in a way that honors the land and that treats the land as a living thing. Thank you so much, Carlito, for sharing that. And we are at time, so we appreciate each and every one of you that have joined us here today. Thank you for being here with us. We will be sending out a recording of this video. Those will also be posted online, so if anybody missed them, they can catch up. I want to give out some particular thank yous. Thank you to Friends of the South Novato Library for helping us put this together. Thank you to Surge, Marin donors and partners. Speakers, please stay after for a few minutes so that we can debrief briefly. And other than that, thank you, each and every one of you, for joining us today. Take care.